welcome back to JW's Backyard. Now, I've been seeing a whole lot of questions lately on Facebook groups about these factory style carburetors, particularly for these Predator 212s. And no matter what the question is, the response is always, get an aftermarket carburetor, like my Chakuni here. And I'll go ahead and tell you, this thing is about as fun as having a traumatic brain injury. If you want something that's going to be unreliable and a headache, go ahead and get you one of these. Makuni, Chakuni, whatever. But the people asking about these factory style carburetors rarely get any help from what I see. They either get a smart aleck response, an insult, somebody saying use the search bar, or just somebody that's just plain wrong. So today we're going to go over these factory style carburetors in depth. So if you're brand new to carburetors and you don't know what a bowl is, what a needle is, what a jet is, we're going to go over it today. And if you know a little bit about carburetors, we're going to break this thing down piece by piece. You might get some help diagnosing a problem, or if you haven't opened one up and tore it apart completely, we're going to go over it. But first, a lot of stuff that I see are people saying that you can't make good power with a factory carburetor, or you can't use a factory carburetor if you have a governor delete. And that information is just plain wrong. If you want something that's reliable and easy to work on and cheap, there's nothing wrong with a factory style carburetor. And I've made plenty of power with a factory style carburetor on multiple carts. I have carts with extensive head work done, intake, exhaust, governor delete, jet, nitrous, and these factory style carburetors work just fine. Now, don't get me wrong, you can make a whole lot more power with an aftermarket carburetor like this. But these require a good bit of knowledge and tuning to get right. So you have to be willing to put in the time and effort to get this thing to run right. But if you're like me and you just want something that's simple and it's going to work, and you just want to be able to get on your cart and ride, factory carburetor may be for you. Make sure you subscribe if you enjoy videos like this, because YouTube tells me most of you who view my videos aren't subscribers. Let's get to work. All right, to get the carburetor off, we got to take the air box off. It's just two 10mm nuts holding it on. And it's usually a good idea to turn the fuel off and run the engine till it goes dead, and it'll drain the fuel bowl so you don't have a lot of fuel in the carburetor when you go to take it off. But we got the two nuts off, and we're going to pull our air box off. Now there is a hose right here connecting the air box, and there is a vent hose coming from the gas tank down here. So we need to pull those two hoses off to get that air box off. And we can just slide our air box off. We need to loosen the clamp on the fuel line before we take it off. Now, if you have fuel in your tank, you need to find some way to either plug that hose or clamp it, or you're going to drain your tank. So now that we got the fuel line unhooked, we can start pulling our carburetor out. And just be mindful that our throttle linkages are still attached up here. As you start to pull the carburetor out, it'll allow you to pull your throttle linkages up out of that clip. Now, if you try to do that before you start pulling the carburetor out, you run the risk of breaking the plastic here. And then you can pull your spring out of there as well. And then our carburetor's off. So let's go over the gasket configuration real quick. So we got the front of the carburetor here. You'll see we have this gasket, and it matches up with the hole here. You see there's a cutout for that hole, and then there is a cutout for this hole over here. So that's how you know this is lined up correctly. And that goes right on the front of the carburetor, and then the air box on top of that. Now back behind the carburetor, you have this flat gasket here, and then you have this plastic bracket that goes on behind it. So this bracket acts as a little spacer, and it holds your fuel line and your spark plug cable. All right, so if we look at this piece so if we look at our spacer, you see the configuration of that gasket there. And if you look at the back of the carburetor, you might think that this hole on the gasket here lines up with this hole over here on the carburetor, but it doesn't. That hole on the gasket actually lines up with this space here. So sometimes that confuses a lot of people when they're trying to figure out the correct orientation of this gasket. And then on the back side of our spacer, you see we have a gasket that goes between that spacer and the head. And you can see the configuration of that. You can see that the head has a flat side and then a curved edge, and the gasket also has a flat side and a curved edge. So the gasket just goes on that way. And all these gaskets are super cheap. You can go on Amazon or eBay and get a whole pack. This pack was $10, and it comes with multiple sets of each of the gaskets. So if you tear one, just go buy a pack of these and you'll be set for probably the life of your engine. All right, so let's get into the carburetor here. Now, you've got your fuel on-off switch. It is this black switch right down here. That's pretty self-explanatory. You got your choke lever here on top, and the backwards position, you see this plate is closed and that's the choke engaged. And the forward position, that plate is open and the choke is off at this point. And then on the top, this little black piece, that is your actual throttle. So you can see as we move that, your butterfly is opening. So that's what's controlling that butterfly opening and closing. And this black screw here, that is your idle screw. So if you look, it's pressing on your throttle lever here. And if you screw that screw in, you can increase your idle speed. Or if you back it out, you can decrease your idle speed. So if your engine keeps trying to cut off, you can increase your idle speed. But if say you have it on a go-kart and your cart keeps trying to run away with you not on it, or your clutch is engaging while you're trying to idle, you may have the idle set a little too high, and you can back that screw down and reduce that idle speed. And on these factory Predator carburetors, there is no mixture screw. Now on some of the aftermarket carburetors, you'll see a little mixture screw right here in this position, but the factory Predators do not have that screw. All right, so next is the bowl here. So if you hear people refer to the bowl, this is what they're talking about. This screw holds the bowl on, and this one here on the side is actually to drain it. But we're going to take the bowl off and show you what's inside there. So it's just a 10mm bolt. You see it has a little seal there that goes on it. And you just pull your bowl right off. There's nothing inside there. Now there is a seal, see this black O-ring here, that seals the bowl when you put it on. So if you have had the bowl off, or even if you haven't had it off and you have fuel leaking out around the bowl, this seal is probably bad or got folded up. Now this white piece here, this is called your float. And how this float works is as the fuel rises in the bowl, this float is just a hollow piece of plastic. It rises with the fuel, and it is connected back here to a little bar that has a pointy tip, and this little bar with the pointy tip is called your needle. And as the float rises, it forces that needle up into a little orifice here and shuts off your fuel coming from your gas tank. So your fuel comes in, goes through the on-off switch here, and makes its way down into the bowl through this little hole. You see there's a little copper piece in there, and fills up your bowl. Now, as that fuel rises, the float rises and blocks off that hole with the needle. So if you have a bunch of fuel leaking and it's not coming out of the bowl where that seal is, and it's just coming out of the carburetor itself, your float may be stuck, or there may be something wrong with your needle, so it's not shutting off the fuel when the bowl fills up. Now the way this goes together, there's a little pin here that slides out. And that's what's holding your float and your needle in. Now you see there's our float and there's our little needle. and that little pointy end is what closes up the hole where the fuel comes in the bowl at. And you can see the needle just clips in that little groove there on the float, and there is a little spring up under that needle that provides a little springiness to it. And you see, there is where your fuel is coming in from the gas tank to the bowl there. That needle just goes in there and blocks that little hole once you have enough fuel in your bowl. But let's put this thing back together. All right, so next is the main jet, which is right down in here. That is what most people change when they put an aftermarket exhaust or filter on. They increase their main jet size. And a lot of people have trouble getting a regular tip screwdriver in here. The flared edges, the wings on it, kind of get in the way, and you can't get down in there deep enough to get that jet out. So you can go to about any hardware store and buy a cabinet tip screwdriver, and you see it doesn't have those wings, and it works real good for getting these jets out. Now, these jets are made out of brass and they're real soft, so you got to be careful not to over tighten them, because they can break and you'll have a hard time getting it out. So we'll just take a flat head screwdriver, we'll stick it in there, and we'll back this jet out. All right, once we got it unscrewed, we can just drop it right out. So that is your main jet. Now, behind that main jet is your emulsion tube. And this helps mix some of the fuel with air coming in from some of your air tubes and the carburetor. So let's dump out our emulsion tube. There it is right there. This side is what goes up. And if you look, it is the top of that emulsion tube that's sticking up in your carb there, where the fuel comes out of the bowl and enters the carb. So you can see the tip of that emulsion tube sticking up in there. But let's pull that out. So some people will upgrade this emulsion tube when they are putting a bigger main jet in and adding intake, exhaust, governor delete to their engine. But I've never had to upgrade one of these. Some of the ones that they upgrade to have more holes, and they say it helps with a smoother idle or better throttle response, but I've never had to upgrade one of these, and I've modified multiple Predators. But they do sell kits where they pair emulsion tubes with aftermarket jets, and people do use them, so that is an option. And you can see I have an aftermarket emulsion tube here that I got with a jet kit that I ordered, and you see it just has a few more holes, and the holes are slightly bigger than the factory one. But like I said, I've never had an issue using the factory emulsion tube with just an upgraded main jet. Now, as far as jets go, you can order kits off of any of the karting websites like OMB Warehouse, Go Power Sports, BMI Karts, or eBay or Amazon. So you can buy kits with multiple different sizes if you're unsure of how much fuel you need. Now, the factory jet that comes in these Predator 212s is a 28 jet. At my elevation in North Carolina, if I add an intake and exhaust and governor delete, I usually have to bump up to a 32 jet. But it's going to vary depending on the climate where you live and the elevation where you live. Now, when people talk about jets, it may be confusing because you'll hear some people say a 32 jet or a 28 jet, which are relatively small numbers, and then you'll hear somebody else talk about a 115 or a 130 jet. And the reason for the big difference in number is because they sell jets measured in millimeters and jets measured in inches. So if you look, This is a 45, and this is a 115. And if you look, and the holes aren't very different in size, so that can be confusing for some people. And I'll add a conversion chart here to compare the sizes. So we have our conversion chart here, and let's look at the 110 jet, for example. So measured in millimeters, that jet is 1.1 millimeter and would have 110 printed on the side of it. If it was measured in inches, it's 0.043 inches and would have 43 printed on it. And those jets are the exact same size. They're just measured with different units of measurement. And jetting is not an exact science. So a lot of people get on the forums and they'll say, hey, I have these modifications. What size jet do I need? And what they don't realize is that what works for one person may not work for them, because jetting is dependent on the elevation where you live, the temperature, and the climate where you live. So it's always a good idea to have a general idea of what size jet you may need, but get a selection of them with sizes above and below what you think you may need, so you have options to go up or down, because it's really an experiment. You're going to put a jet in, you're going to see how your engine responds. Your engine may run too lean, meaning it doesn't have enough fuel, and it may have trouble running without the choke on, and you may need to go up in jet size, or your engine may just run rough and smoke a lot, indicating you're running too rich or have too much fuel, and you may need to go down in jet size. But you just have to realize that what works for one person may not work for you, and it is an experiment, and you do have to do some testing. All right, so next is your idle jet, and that is this little black piece right here. So to get that out, you have to take your idle screw out. And you just take a screwdriver and you pry that thing out. Just be careful with it. And that is your low-speed jet. Now, I've never had to change one of these either in all my days of modifying Predators, but they do sell kits that include the emulsion tube, the main jet, and a new low-speed jet. Now, this is to help with idling, but like I said, I've never had an issue with fueling with a factory emulsion tube and factory low-speed jet and just changing the main jet. And there are two O-rings on here. There's one right there and one right there. But we'll just pop that back in. So let's go over a little troubleshooting now. So something I see pretty often is people saying that they can only get their engine to run with the choke on. So there's a couple different things that could cause this, but essentially what it means when you can only get your engine to run with the choke on is that you're not getting enough fuel for the amount of air that you're putting in. So when you put the choke on, you're blocking off most of the air that's going to the engine. Now, the first thing this could be caused by is a vacuum leak, meaning one of the gaskets behind the carburetor is leaking. So it could be your gasket between your head and that spacer, or it could be your gasket between the spacer and your carburetor. So always check those gaskets if you're having an issue running with the choke off. Another thing is that your carburetor just may be gunked up. So if you're not going to be using your engine for a while, most people suggest turning the fuel off and draining the bowl here so there's not fuel sitting in the carburetor gunking it up as it decays. And you saw all the tiny little holes in the emulsion tube, the main jet, the idle jet, and you see all the little tiny passageways in this carburetor. They get clogged up really easily if you let fuel sit in them. So the next time you go to use your engine and you've had that gas just sitting in there decaying, it can clog up all those tiny little holes, causing you not to get good fuel delivery and causing it to only run with the choke on, since it can't get enough fuel to handle the amount of air you're putting in it. Now, if your problem is a clogged up carburetor, you can take it apart like we went over before and clean out all those little orifices and clean out those jets and emulsion tube, and sometimes you can get it running like normal. I've had a couple though that even though I've cleaned them out really well, they just still never ran right. But these carburetors are cheap enough that you could just buy another one if you didn't want to go through the trouble of cleaning one out. You can get these things for about $12 on eBay or Amazon, and they work just fine. And those aftermarket ones, a lot of them have a little mixture screw there in the side where you can control that air to fuel mixture. But something I found helpful when cleaning out these carburetors are little bitty kits like this that you can get off of eBay or Amazon again. And they are really useful at getting into those tiny little holes in that carburetor and cleaning out some of that more stubborn stuff that carburetor spray won't get out. So you see it comes with some little files or pins, and then it comes with a little brush set. And I think I got multiple packs of these for around $10. So the next thing I see, which is probably the most common issue with running only on choke, is somebody has modified their engine, added a aftermarket intake, exhaust, taken the governor out, and the engine will only run on the choke. And if that's the case and your gaskets are good, carburetor's clean, then you probably just need a bigger main jet. That just means you don't have enough fuel for the increased air that you're using now. So you just need to keep going up in jet size until you're able to run with the choke off, and when you hit the gas, it's picking up speed instead of stalling out. And one other issue that's a little less common that reduced fuel flow in one of my engines was I'd used some line that was not rated for fuel as a fuel line, and it had degraded the rubber, and the rubber was essentially chunking off inside of the fuel line and getting down in the carburetor and clogging it up. So it had got down in the inlet and clogged up the on-off switch. So if you want to take the on-off switch apart, you just take these two screws at the top, and there's a little washer on top. You have your on-off switch, and under the on-off switch is a little diaphragm here. And what had happened with me is some of that rubber had got down in there and was clogging that up, and I just took it apart and cleaned it out, and it started working fine. And under the on-off switch, there's a little chamber down here. It just comes off with a 10mm socket. And if we look in there, it's just a little bowl. There's an O-ring up in there, and there's two holes coming from the on-off switch and going down into the bowl. Now on the opposite side of the spectrum, you can put too big of a jet in your carburetor. And usually what you'll see with too big of a jet is the engine will still idle. You can run with the choke off, but when you go to press the gas, it may stall a little bit, or it may spit and sputter, and that spit and sputter may clear up as you increase in RPM. But you can just tell the engine's not happy and not running very efficiently. And a lot of times you'll get some smoke out the exhaust. So if your engine is misbehaving like that, you may just need to go down in jet size. Now, I had that exact issue on Power Wheels Mustang here. I'd added some nitrous to it, and I'd went up to a jet size that I used on one of my other nitrous engines, and it was just too much for this engine because the exhaust is pretty restrictive and the intake is a little more restrictive than my other engine. So it's running really bad when I was off the nitrous. So I just bumped down a couple sizes in jet and it cleared up, and now it runs good with and without the nitrous. But that's about all I got for you today. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. I'll see you next time.